Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to today's conversation. My name is Dulce Guzman. I am the Executive Director of Alianza Americas. We are a national network of more than 50 Latin American and Caribbean immigrant-led, community-based organizations working together to foster an inclusive, equitable, and sustainable way of life for migrants in the U.S. and in our countries of origin. Before we begin, we want to remind everyone that interpretation services are available. This conversation will be conducted in English, but you can access interpretation by clicking the globe icon at the bottom right part of your screen and selecting the language that you would like to listen to today's event in. This webinar is part of Alianza America's Somos Comunidad initiative. It is an initiative that creates a transnational space for learning and exchange on migration governance. While many policies focus on border control, especially on a moment like now, this initiative highlights the key role of local governments and civil society in building a long-term inclusion and community well-being. Its approach goes beyond traditional integration, which often places the burden on migrants. Instead, it centers inclusion, recognizing that public institutions have the responsibility to ensure everyone, regardless of status, has equal access to services, rights, and opportunities. We recently released a report on Somos Comunidad that we will share in the chat, and we invite you to read when you have some time to learn more about some of that work that we have done already. Today's discussion is grounded in the understanding that education is not simply a service provided by governments, but a cornerstone of participation, belonging, and community building, and that includes migrant communities. In 1982, the United States Court in Plyer versus Doe ruled that undocumented children could not be denied access to free public K-12 education. Writing for the majority, Justice William J. Brennan, Jr. emphasized the essential role education plays in maintaining what he called the fabric of our society. He warned that excluding undocumented children from education would pose lasting social, economic, intellectual, and psychological harm, not only on the children themselves, but on society as a whole. More than 4 decades later, that ruling continues to shape conversations about migration, inclusion, and equity in education worldwide. This event explores how classrooms can serve as spaces of inclusion, belonging, and opportunity. We will discuss the policies and practices that support migrant students, examine the barriers that many children still face, and highlight how inclusive educational systems ultimately strengthen entire communities. Joining us here today are 2 experts on this matter. I would like to welcome both Sarah Dryden-Peterson and Margie McHugh. Thank you so much for joining us. Sarah is a professor of education at Harvard University and director of Refugee Reach, an initiative housed within the university that, through collaborative research, education, and action, fosters welcoming communities and quality education in settings of migration and displacement. Margie is the director of the National Center on Immigrant Integration Policy at the Migration Policy Institute, which provides in-depth research, policy analysis, technical assistance, training, and information resource services to a range of stakeholders on a broad array of immigration inclusion topics. Thank you both so much for joining us today. We're going to begin the conversation with a few questions, and then afterwards we'll have time for Q&A. We want to start off by understanding the challenges. We want to hear from you the different experiences that you have, whether it's in the US or outside, about what those most pressing barriers for migrant and undocumented students continue to face are today regarding their inclusion. Are there any factors that are often overlooked that need to be considered when thinking about inclusion in education? Why don't we start, whoever would like to begin?
Sarah, do you want to start?
Sure, I can. Thanks, Dulce. It's really wonderful to be here. I thought I might start with a few challenges that I see that continue to shape the ways in which we create spaces for inclusion. And really, kind of 3 things. The first, I think, is this is what we see a lot in our work, which is more global in nature, is that there are these disconnects between 3 elements of education that are essential for students and families to feel a sense of inclusion and belonging. And these disconnects are between access to schooling, learning, while in school and opportunities to use that learning to create the kinds of lives that any of us might seek to create. And so, what we see that this looks like globally is that even in situations where migrant or undocumented students, most of my work is with refugee students in places like Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, Lebanon, are have access to schools and have legal access to schools, as Dulce has just described as well, that often that access doesn't create opportunities for learning in the classroom. So students sit in school, but they're unable to learn for all different kinds of reasons. And some of those barriers include language, an inability to understand what's going on in the classroom, and lack of resources to support new language learning or bilingual or multilingual education. Some of those barriers are related to relationships, the kinds of discrimination that students who have migrated from somewhere else feel as a result of curriculum that doesn't represent them, doesn't include them, or relationships that are filled with a kind of hostility that prevents students from learning. And then often these situations where learning doesn't happen translate into a disconnection between that access to school, the lack of learning, and then lack of opportunities to be able to contribute to society. In many of the places that I work, the migrants and refugees, students with whom I work, don't have access to legal documentation that would allow them to continue into higher education, to have a job, to own property, to participate civically and politically in similar ways that undocumented students graduate into that lack of opportunity in the United States. And so these disconnects all along the way create the situation where students don't feel, even if they do sit in classrooms, like they are included in the promise that education creates. Just quickly, the second two. I think the second challenge is really that often what we see is educators trying to create education that truly is inclusive, that truly does connect access, learning, and opportunity. And that may happen in classrooms, and then students leave classrooms and find themselves in situations where that reality doesn't match, where they do feel threatened in communities, where they do face threats of deportation, where they do face discrimination on the way to school. And then the third part, I think that you mentioned also, Dulce, is I think we do have a lack of attention to what it means for those who have not migrated to create inclusive communities. So that often we are focusing on the experiences of migrant students, but students who have lived for a long time in the same place and are experiencing new students arriving in classrooms, are experiencing multilingualism for the first time, are also experiencing a changed world. And so I think that we need to focus on this mutual interaction between longtime residents and those who may be just arriving, to create a kind of inclusive environment where there is a mutual sense of how do we create this new community together that may have changed for all of us. Margie, I'll turn it over to you.
That was such a great kind of broad look at things, Sarah. And I think the only things I would add are that, this is going on every day in every part of our country for kids of who are both U.S. citizens, but from migrant background families, kids who have kids and schools and teachers and families where you've got various contexts of resettlement and of how far along or how experienced their school systems are, like where are they on the road? Because for a long time, we've all been relying on the Plyler decision, and Dulce, I thought that was great that you brought that up from the beginning. The other key kind of piece upholding the system is the Lau decision, which happened, I think, in 1974, which said that kids should be able to comprehend the curriculum that's going on in the classroom, and that's a fight that's still ongoing in schools all over the. Sorry, I shouldn't say it's a fight. I should like in the course of my career immigration has gone from a 5 state issue to like a 48 state issue. And so I really appreciate that it has taken a while for systems, depending on who was arriving in their communities, what particular needs they might have, what kind of resources they had in their districts to start with. Were they near any place that even had a master's program in ESL? Like there were just so many capacity building things that needed to happen. But so anyway, I just wanted to say we should think about context of reception. If we're talking about the United States, we should think about the various mixed status families and those sorts of things, because of course most of our children in U.S. schools are U.S. citizens. But then the full context of right now, of course, is kids who were fearing that either they themselves might be unmasked as unauthorized because of not even direct practices of schools, but what's happening with the attempts to not allow school districts to simply say that their entire school is eligible for free lunch. Like there's a lot of destabilizing things that are happening to other parts of the school system because of the multi-front attempt to kind of pull these kids out, unmask them, and unmask their parents. And of course, we're all waiting with bated breath for the Supreme Court decision in the birthright citizenship case, which would really profoundly destabilize even the already difficult situation that schools and teachers and families are in right now, with all the enforcement activities that are happening. And I'm glad that the framing questions for this session are more about solutions. But I'll just say that the other big worry that I think we need to anticipate, given the current environment we're in, is that um, some members of Congress have figured out that it's not it's not pinned in to the Plyler law that you can't ask students for immigration status information when they register. That's just simply a policy that came down from the Department of Education for many years. And we may be facing fairly soon a requirement from the Department of Ed. Well, not a requirement, that the Department of Ed is being encouraged to make sure that school systems know that they may collect immigration status of children simply for what they call administrative purposes. And so that would be very, very destabilizing, because as Sarah was pointing out, you can have legal access, but that can be chilled by various kind of enrollment processes. And of course, you could also be in a school where you don't have appropriate instruction, and that's another piece that's trying to be pulled out. The president's budget that was introduced about 2 weeks ago, again, tries to get rid of support for English language acquisition. So that didn't work last year. Hopefully it won't work this year with the Congress, but certainly things that have kind of been firmly placed in our laws for multiple decades are being attacked on in a pretty comprehensive way right now.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Margie. I really appreciate the Sarah, the framing, beginning from it's not just about access. A lot of times, fortunately, as of now, there is access. But once there's access, there also needs to be intentional ways to include both children that might be new to the school district or new to the country, but also including the experience of the students. And Margie, I think you did a great job of explaining that the situation that we're facing is multi-layered. And I think the things that you point to just demonstrate that there has been a need for decades to strengthen our laws to ensure that they are just not as fragile as they are right now. Because many of the things that we're seeing are coming down very fast. Yes, using methods that are going around some laws, but also things that are being pushed through narrative. So these stories of how this affects not only immigrant children, but how this affects the community as a whole, I think needs to be a reflection that more people need to be talking about. So I wanted to go into examples, but as you mentioned, there are a series of questions where we'll dig into examples like this next one. How can the classroom become a space for inclusion for migrant and undocumented children? What does it look like to be meaningfully included in this particular setting, and why is that important? And I'll start with Margie this time.
Um, I'm fine with doing that. I'll be mainly talking though about the U.S. context, and so I love Sarah opening up with the big, broad international, but because it gets pretty wonky, if you get down to the real particulars, and but I do think that that folks that you've assembled for the call might really, that might be very actionable for them, and so. So I would say, first of all, these things sound easy, but they're not. Having instructional programs that make sense for the students who are in the classroom. These are there's the whole sociological context for that for both the school and for children that I know a lot of teachers worry about, but they're really tied to our system of having to advance kids and have schools be judged, are they effective or not, by various moments of testing across a kid's educational career in K-12 schools. And so if you get close to the ground, there's enormous questions of fairness about whether we're really using instructional models that meet the needs of students. And even if we recently, well, not that recently, but in the past year, we published a report on instructional that included a whole look at instructional programs in the state of Connecticut, which is considered one of the best states in the country for K-12 education. And they, like many states, it makes it sound like they have great instructional programs because they've had a bilingual law since the 1970s that was fought for very hard by Puerto Rican families that had been living in the state for many years. So they had bilingual programs, their state policies and guidance. If you look closely, what it was really just saying is you may do all these kinds of instruction, and even with their bilingual law that really seemed to have more teeth, there's many, many ways to get waivers to not have to provide the really quality instructional programs that are needed. And one of the surprising things we found, and I hope I get the number right, but I think we found that if you look at the state of Oregon and the state of Connecticut, they had very similarly sized English learner populations, and Oregon had something like 140 or 150 dual language instructional programs, and Connecticut had 25. I mean, it was a ridiculous disparity, right? And part of it is that their state higher ed has never really been pushed to try and produce the teachers that are needed to provide quality instruction. Oh, they even passed a parent's law recently, a parent's bill of rights, a multilingual learner bill of rights that said that your child is entitled to instruction that keeps them that's on grade level so that they're learning the same curriculum as kids who are in an English only class, and that they also had access to bilingual programs, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, the state didn't even know that they weren't providing that most of what they thought their good laws were leading to really was not being implemented in practice. And of course, it wasn't the fault of the teachers or the principal. Well, in some cases, it could be principals and district leaders that, a new person comes in and they're like, why are we spending all this time on these programs that are so hard to run and to hire teachers for? And so they just get rid of them. There's definitely a history of that, of just not having superintendents who feel under pressure to raise scores and the like, and who never really have delved into English learner issues. Anyway, sorry. So I would just say there's a lot there that you can work on close to the community level. And it's been a dream of ours forever that we could have more folks who are working in the with immigrant communities at the community level really bring K-12 education quality issues into the work that they do, but they very often don't get any support for really understanding what's happening in education policy, fighting for the money that's needed. And really, the other problem with trying to change schools' policies is that parents, they're moving with their children through the system. So all these parents who learn what's wrong with an elementary school, then they go up to the middle school level. They're not going to stay with that elementary school advocacy, for 5, 10, 15 years. They're moving up with their child through the system. And usually after elementary school, parents are less and less engaged because their kids are more independent. And so there's a little bit less advocacy. But anyway, I had other things I was going to say about effective policy and practice, but I think it's effective programming. It's teachers who are trained to run them. It's money where it's needed, and then it's just advocacy and really having some sort of diligence. And we can get to this later about the looking ahead, but I also think we're in an era where all of the civil rights protections that we've relied on at the federal level need to be brought down to the state level. And when they're brought down, they need to include that there's authority at the state level to penalize schools that aren't providing effective instruction, aren't providing language access. So many states do a thou shalt model. You should be doing this, you should be doing that. This is best practice. We're going to tell you what best practice is, but we always leave schools with so much independence and never say, we're going to actually penalize you because we're trying to have a model of letting people respond to their local circumstances. It's always a balance, but too often the balance goes against what's good for English learner and immigrant kids. Sorry, Sarah, that took way too long. And sorry, Dulce.
No.
Plenty of time. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
great. Oh, no, thanks, Margie. And um, I'll pick up on a couple threads here because I think one of the things um, that I think a lot about is I think the second sentence you said, Margie, is just how hard this work is for educators. That almost every teacher I have ever met, no matter where in the world, actively wants to meet the needs of their students. Sometimes we don't know what the needs of our students are. Sometimes we don't have the training or the time to meet those needs. And in fact, I think it's very rare situations where teachers in classrooms are actively trying not to meet the needs of some of their students. And so I think a lot about what is it that we can do to support educators to actively be able to meet those needs. And some of it is more time, some of it is more money, some of it is more training, some of it is stronger political environments to be able to do the work that they seek to do. Um, but I think part of that is also trying to figure out where the knowledge is to do this work well. And my inclination is to often think that it actually rests with educators. And so trying to think about how can we learn from teachers who are doing the daily work of teaching students. I see some questions in the Q&A here, students who have not been able to experience education before they arrive in the US or have been in completely different education systems, who don't have access to language learning, who don't have access to transportation. How can we think about what it is that educators do to meet those needs and amplify those so that other educators can learn from those kinds of practices? And I think that part of that does need to do with in-service training. So certainly we need to think about the way educators are trained from the beginning. But often this training needs to happen while teachers are actively educating. And so what are the resources that at the state level or at community level we may be able to draw on in terms of community organizations that could support teachers to learn more about migration law, to learn more about experiences of students in education prior to arrival in the US, for example. Are there ways in which we could free up teacher time so that teachers could talk to each other about what it is that they are struggling with? One of the most interesting kind of elements of conversations among educators of migrant students that I've been involved with recently really are transnational kinds of questions. For example, I was in South Africa last January and talking with teachers who are trying to figure out how to advise their students who are facing barriers to accessing school. So, students who are being prevented from accessing school if they appear to be migrants or are identified as migrants. And teachers in South Africa saying, actually, this sounds a little bit like what educators in the US must be facing as they think about whether or not to advise their children to come to school or to stay home if there is a real threat of deportation, for example. And educators truly, none of us, I don't think, really know what to do in that situation. Do we encourage children to come to school if we believe in the instruction that's being offered? We believe in the opportunity of school, but we see the risk, the physical risk of that journey to school or being in school. And how might we bring educators together to really think about how they weigh those different risks and also what the consequences of the decisions that we make are for students in understanding their role within society. So, what message do young children take if the message is to stay home because it's not safe enough? Or what message do young children take when the message is, come to school, we'll figure out a way to make you safe, and then all of a sudden they don't feel safe? A lot of the work that I do is with older students, and what we see globally is how much students appreciate it when teachers bring those dilemmas to the students so that the students are really able to see how educators are thinking about how do I meet the needs of people who speak 10 different languages in my classrooms? What decisions am I making about what language I'm teaching in when? What the official policy is versus what wiggle room I have as a teacher, and that students are learning just as much from these in the moment kinds of decisions as they are from the official curriculum in that way. I guess just one last thought. This you started, Dilse, with this kind of how can the classroom be a space for inclusion and what does it look like? I also think that there are very few spaces in our society where community by necessity has to be created anew every year. The way we organize our education systems is that a whole group of students come into a class every year and it's kind of reconstituted and there are different kids, different teachers. And so in some ways, we have the most opportunities within schools to think about what do we want that community to look like? What do we want inclusion to look like? Because it happens every year. And we're working with the folks in society who perhaps have the most experience in really doing that, of thinking about what does it mean to make sure every kid feels like they have a few relationships where they can really count on that. What does it mean to make sure that kids are sitting in a way that they can talk to each other and engage with each other? What does it mean for kids to see on the wall something that would make them feel like this is a place they want to be in? And so thinking about what knowledge already resides in schools that way, I think can help us think through what these spaces of inclusion really look like in education.
Thank you. I think consistent or similar to what we were talking about before. It's like building the community around that because it's not just when the student is in school or when the teacher is teaching, but it's really also external things that affect kids when they come in. And when there are times that students are want to or not are seeing in the news that people like them or their parents don't belong. School oftentimes is that safe space. So right now we are hearing from a lot of students who are being, having to stay home because they're not able to get dropped off because there's fear of separation, things like that. But to that student, maybe that might be the only meal that they have when they go to school. So thank you so much for sharing that. And I want to ask, or I want to bring in one of the questions from the chat or one of the comments, because I think Margie, you touched on the fact that there are a lot of policies already in place. So I'll bring up the comment in a second because now I'm going to ask what practices or policies have proven effective in fostering inclusion for migrant students and what has made them successful. So we know there is a lot of really good policies and practices at the local level and also outside the US. So we would love to hear examples from your work.
Um, Sarah, I mean, I can start this since you just did yeoman's duty there with everything you were saying, but maybe we don't have to stick with that. But well, I would say the two bedrock pieces, and I guess this is relevant, Dulce, because we're talking about what states maybe need to do on their own looking ahead. You know, like a lot of things with the many things that are being upended under the second Trump administration. I think there's a lot of shock that the administration's been able to move so fast, and that in some cases, some of the things that appear to be obviously illegal are being stopped in the courts, but it's really taking a while. But I think it's also for folks in the education field, really made many folks realize that that since education is so in so many ways left to states and localities, and now that we see this vulnerability at the federal level, and we're not sure where a Supreme Court challenge, for example, on Plyler might lead, that a lot of states are recognizing that they need to put some of the basic civil rights laws into practice in their own states. And the thing is that education is sort of split governance in some cases where it's a board of ed that's making the decisions, and not really the state legislature, although ultimately money to fund education usually, comes out of the legislature. And so folks have to just sort of get out in front of that at their state level, and make sure that their laws are protecting rights that they think really need to be protected, and elements of quality that they need to be protected. Some of that has happened in states, many states, because in having to comply with the Lau decision about having an instructional program that's comprehensible to children and meets their needs, many states, well, some of it has happened because the Office of Civil Rights at the Department of Ed over the years has brought major lawsuits against many states for not providing effective instruction for English learner kids. But so I would just say that the basics of access and of instructional program quality are things that should be pinned into law. And then many of us sort of grew up in an era where there was an Office of Civil Rights that was enforcing basic things like language access in school districts, which is a very critical piece for parents understanding and being engaged in their children's education and the like. So I think that those are the real like bases. And then if it's a state that's being forced to pay attention about whether they are meeting the needs or being able to staff these instructional programs, whether schools have the technical assistance and the ongoing knowledge built in around them that helps them, because there's churn all the time in school districts and the like, and it's really hidden from view from most of the public how much goes on behind the scenes to help teachers be able to adjust curriculum, to bring on to onboard new teachers, all that sort of stuff that would have the skills to be able to be working with a diverse student body. All of those things, need to be funded, and you need to have close to the ground knowledge around them. And so I think this is also a thing that just many folks in the foundation world have failed to understand, that these are such critically important issues to immigrant families. Their children are their hope. Their children are the reason that they're very often putting up with such difficult circumstances in their own lives, because they're trying to offer their children a better future. And yet I think we think the education problems are solved, but school systems need an awful lot of backup from the public. And then one small thing I wanted to say just before we move on too far away from it. I was really struck by some of what Sarah was saying, and I'm sure you'll say that you and your network know about the Welcoming America network that's working on local contexts of reception. I was just with a bunch of them at a convening last week, and it included a lot of county and city government leaders. And there was a big focus on racial equity, on upward mobility for immigrant families at the city and county level. And I'm just thinking that like trying to really do an overlay and a match, in a lot of areas where, where where the two networks are coexisting. I think that this issue of education is one where people really could tangibly get involved in initiatives around inclusion, and be helping with exactly what you were saying earlier about helping folks get their kids to school, bringing food to families whose neighborhoods are, there's a lot of people who want to help out, and energy that could be tapped. And then also, I think folks who would understand the importance of advocating around school funding and school system issues. And all of that is going to get harder as as the effects of the law that was signed, the budget agreement that was signed last July, start coming down. States are really going to have to be they're facing already holes in their Medicaid funding, holes in their SNAP funding, and and state budgets are the main place that state and local budgets are the main places where school funding comes from. And I think a lot of state legislators, if you're in a state where they feel like they don't have power, that the power belongs to their state board of ed or things like that, they'd love to know the ways that they could be helpful, the hearings that they could have, that sort of thing. So, love to stay in touch with you about any follow-up that might be helpful around there, because we've been thinking a lot about even just trying to work with NALEO and elected official groups like that, trying to figure out how to help elected officials really pay more attention to what might be happening to school funding and the like, once we're making our way through what are likely to be ongoing Plyler challenges, and hopefully not a decision that destabilizes birthright citizenship. But we're only a small ways into this new period of destabilization, and I think getting elected officials at the state and county levels on board is really important.
Um,
Sarah?
sure. Just a few things. I think one of the questions that that I hear both of you raising is around this question of what the context of reception is and what kind of experience and knowledge and different kinds of practices exist within that context. So some school districts have a lot of experience in welcoming newcomer students, and some school districts have very little experience in that. And just as Margie, you're talking about these kinds of networks, also wondering how there might be more exchange among these different school districts that may have different types of expertise and knowledge and experience. And we certainly see a lot of this in the global context. Well, a lot of unseized opportunities as well as some seized opportunities. And I think that often when an issue feels new again in some ways, when the challenges and threats to migrant students' experiences in schools feel more urgent and pressing as they do at this moment, it can be easy to forget long histories of educating students who speak many languages in school. So we see this often in the case of refugee situations where, for example, in Lebanon, as many Syrian students began to arrive in Lebanon in the mid 2000s or mid 2010s, a kind of amnesia about the fact that there have been Palestinian refugees in Lebanon for decades, and all sorts of knowledge and experience and thinking about what it means to educate for a near future that may be in the country of exile and a far future that may be unknowable in some ways. So, how do we tap into some of this ongoing knowledge and expertise that way? And I think some of the clear policies and practices around that that do exist in some countries, and we see in pockets within the US, relate to teacher pipeline programs that can work with migrant communities and educators who have migrant backgrounds to create the programs that allow their often certifications from a home country to be recognized in the US, or to gain certification that can allow for educators to be within schools in the US. And we see this happen. There's an interesting program in Ontario, in Canada, where it's a lot more of a kind of accompaniment program and thinking about ways to include migrant parents in schools in important school-based roles that can create opportunities for more multilingual spaces within a school, or for cultural understanding as teachers are seeking to create relevant curriculum and have questions, as well as opportunities for long-term stable employment for migrant parents and others within the migrant community. I think just another point on these kind of policies and practices. Within the field of education, we often talk about this idea of discretionary spaces within classrooms and schools. These like in the moment decisions that teachers are making and have the flexibility to make. And that can be both helpful and harmful in many ways. So those discretionary spaces can be spaces where microaggressions proliferate, or harmful interactions happen. It can also be the spaces where official curriculum gets adapted to reflect more of the reality that students are needing. And I think we see a lot more of this in the policy space now too, of where are these discretionary spaces where local actors, state actors are able to act in ways that support migrant students in schools. Even if there's not a clear policy in place to do that. And I think we need to think about the ways in which those discretionary spaces are mobilized, but also that they might be codified. Margie, I think coming back to your point, at the state level or local level, as the kinds of supports that may have existed for decades, but may be under threat by changing policy environments, so that they might be preserved for the future in that way.
Thank you, Sarah. Part of a portion of our network works a lot with parent educator programs or parent navigator programs, where they're engaging parents to learn more about the school system, or try to just understand how to navigate their community. And I think, Margie, what you were saying of like the state and the local and different ways for them to get involved is a way to promote community informing policy. And I was going to bring up how do you enforce these policies that are already in place, as a comment shared. And I saw, Margie, you answered about the importance of task forces, school boards, even committees. There's usually advisory committees as well, where people can participate to give feedback on how the implementation of a policy is going, or perhaps other ideas for ways that there could be more parent engagement, or even support for teachers, because as you said, there's a million jobs and hats that teachers in the classroom have to play. But if we're able to connect these resources around the community to help the school, then it's really a community trying to build a different environment for all the children and families in that space. I want to make sure that we get to Q&A because there is a lot of great activity. So this last block of questions is more looking ahead. How can access to education for undocumented and migrant students strengthen social cohesion and long-term community well-being?
Um, well, I'll just jump in and say two things about trying to do that in the current context that I think are opportunities. So in many states, well, I would say across the country over the last 10 to 15 years, there's been so much more attention to the early childhood space and to how much brain development happens in children before the age of 5. And it's created a lot of motivation, and it's managed to be a bipartisan issue in many states to expand pre-K programs. At the federal level, I would say there's still kind of brittle politics about does Head Start work or doesn't it? But I think most states are sold because many of them thought under No Child Left Behind, the big education law that was passed in the earlier 2000s, I think they all were expecting that high schools were going to be closed under it because of they had pretty strict rules about schools being closed if they were underperforming and people were dumbfounded across the country that it was mostly elementary schools that were going to be closed because nobody thought there was anything wrong with elementary schools. And there wasn't necessarily anything wrong with elementary schools. I think it was more that we were failing to understand that kids weren't at the same starting line coming into kindergarten, and that there were massive differences in the language skills that kids had and the complexity of language, which is very much related to their overall cognitive development in their early years. So hence billions of dollars going into this from the state level to expand pre-K. And so now that schools have been doing that, and now that their populations overall are dropping in many states, there's a little more money on the table potentially in coming years. If they keep the money in their pre-K to 12 systems, they might have more per pupil money. I think I just heard that Los Angeles thinks they've lost 17,000 students in the last 2 years. Like there's a lot of drop off in kids post COVID. You know, lots of other things have gone on that we wouldn't have time to talk about now, including everything that's happening with immigration enforcement. But anyway, I think it's a positive story there in the early childhood space. And many states are adding pre-K in their formal elementary schools. So instead of it all being at a United Way or at a local church, very often they're pushing those kids, and especially if they're special needs kids, they're putting them under the roof of their elementary schools and in that formal part of the system. And when you do that, you then have to recognize that these kids are English learners, not because of just because by virtue of receiving federal dollars in a school, the whole host of federal civil rights laws applies. Now, the federal government's not going to give a school a hard time if they're not following the 64 Civil Rights Act and the like. But they'll be pretty afraid that 2 years from now, if there's a new president, that there might be lawsuits against them from a revitalized Office of Civil Rights. And the whole reason they're doing pre-K in their elementary schools is because they want the kids to be on track. And so I think it's a really good opportunity to be bringing families in. You know, the only people that are going to bring a child in as a 4-year-old is a parent that you've reached in their language, made them comfortable, told them how much you really want to care for their kids and help them succeed, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a great place for folks to try and intervene and get kids off on, have immigrant families be connected to schools and be on a good track. And then I think a place where we all have the law on our side is if kids are special needs and have developmental delays or are in special education, and you've got even more laws on your side about how those parents need language access, how they legally have to understand what the services are that might be being provided to their child, that the child needs to understand the services that are being the you know have to have a service that they can comprehend, et cetera. So I think if you're in a, you know, we're very conscious that everybody's in different state contexts and that, you know, there's a number of states that are really leaning in and trying to do really, really, really do the best and keep moving forward with immigrant background kids. Other states, not so much. But so that special education and I think the pre-K space are places where you can create a beachhead in local school districts where people are doing right by these families and following civil rights laws that then other folks can dip in, use the, pay for their part of a language access line or, reach some families that have kids in multiple grades. Like there's ways that having really good things growing in a school district, even if the overall context is not good, still creates a place where educators can talk to one another, share practices, try and convince their districts, to move forward with those kinds of initiatives. Go ahead, Sarah.
Yeah, I'll just pick up, I think, where you left off. There were three things I was thinking about. The first, um, is that my observation has been that everywhere in the world, refugee and migrant students attend the schools that are attended by the most marginalized students within that country. So if you look at a place like Lebanon, you see that any family who can afford access to private school does so. And all refugee students are included in public schools that serve the most economically marginalized Lebanese students. And I think we see the same patterns across districts in the US, in Canada, in other places where I work, like Kenya and South Africa. And I think if we think about this larger goal of social cohesion and opportunity for all, that there are ways we can think about supporting both migrant students and citizen students, longtime resident students, those who have longtime presence in a community, to both be doing better, to both be demanding more of an education system that is often failing to live up to its promise. And I think the second piece of that kind of circles back to what I started with in this. I don't think we can have education that truly enable some kind of social cohesion and community well-being if we don't work on those links between access, learning, and opportunity. Because when a kid goes to school, there's an implicit kind of promise that a state or whoever is the authority for education is making, that that schooling is important for some reason, that that schooling is important for participation in society. And when that schooling can't translate into that participation because the quality is not high enough, the language is not understandable, the opportunities are not there, the legal rights to translate that education into opportunity don't exist, then we've all broken the promise to kids that we make the day that we drop them off at Head Start or the day that we walk them to school or the day they get on a bus to go. And then the third piece, this one of my colleagues, Gabriel Oliveira, has been doing work in Brazil, in a rural area of Brazil that borders Venezuela. And one of the things that she has been documenting is children's communities of solidarity. And in particular, what she sees is has seen is a real resistance on the part of adults to think about the role that Spanish might play in a school in Brazil where the language of instruction is Portuguese. And the children figuring out ways to live multilingual lives, to communicate with each other because they want to know each other. They want to communicate with each other. And through the children's networks of figuring out how to communicate in both Spanish and Portuguese, that they create opportunities for their teachers to think more about multilingual education and subsequently for the district to do that. And I think this idea of social cohesion kind of coming from policies and coming from large scale kind of initiatives sometimes can overlook the very real social cohesion that happens when kids are on the playground or when kids are in a classroom together that we might also learn from and build to scale in some ways.
Thank you for sharing that beautiful example. We have a few minutes left. We have 7 minutes left. And there are quite a few questions in the chat. So I want to see if we can get to at least two or three of them. The first one, given that educational inclusion processes also depend on family, economic, and community factors, which comprehensive support models have proven most effective in your countries, or in the US that you've seen at preventing school dropout or discontinuation among migrant populations?
I'm generally pretty upset that we don't do, we're supposed to be doing some of that work with federal adult education dollars, and that's really kind of been pushed um, out of the system, and even more so now that that the whole office has been relocated to the Department of Labor, and so I think most of the programs that are working are not being done in any systematic way. but like the instinct behind the question there, or what the question is pointing at, is a fairly uh, is something that can happen both at the community level from good CBOs. I'm sure a lot of the folks in your network are aware of, just incredible work that's been done every place from worker centers, plenty of refugee organizations that, that have different types of groups running, and community groups generally that meet regularly with their members and the like. That school system issues very often are coming up. Labor unions have been doing it in a number of cases. So I would just say that 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 there aren't it's almost impossible to say that there are best practices because the populations are so different, the circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. And I don't know, I know this is very unscientific, but to say just do it is what I'm inclined to say, because I think you'll find good examples in your community. You'll find people from schools that are really, really eager to speak with you about this, and to send folks to be in touch with the like and in the like and talk about what's happening. So, and I do find adult educators, in addition to all the folks who are working in counseling at schools, like there's a lot of professionals within systems that aren't the overloaded teachers. They're overloaded guidance counselors and the like, but also on the adult ed side, I think there's a really big commitment there among those who are trying to work with adults to be connected more to communities and to offer that kind of assistance to groups that are trying to work with parents around that.
So,
Sarah, you must know a lot.
I don't know that I have much to add there. I think we could probably add in another question just so we have time for as many as possible.
I will ask, I think one more. Um, how can schools and communities protect and support educators who go beyond the official curriculum to provide culturally responsive, inclusive, and emotionally supportive learning environments for students? Teachers were mentioned a lot as key to this. So talking about protecting and how to support them, I think, is really important.
Sure, I'm happy to start with that one. I think this is such an important question. And some of the work that we've been doing, we're calling it pedagogies of belonging, but really trying to document educators' practices globally, educators who work with migrant, refugee, and other displaced students. And one of the practices that we see globally, often the practices look different, but the purposes are often quite similar. So things like creating relevant curriculum, recognizing identities, but one of them is addressing the risks within the work. So teachers really thinking about what are they risking in I see the question kind of protecting and supporting students by adapting the official curriculum, providing culturally responsive curriculum. And I think that what we see educators globally doing, there's a pretty old study now, but that looked at educators in Aceh, Indonesia, which has been a site of long-term conflict and natural disaster. And teachers there describe themselves as the fruit caught between two stones. And I appreciate that metaphor because I think what the teachers there are describing is they feel like they're caught between the state, which is their boss and employer and the holder of their livelihoods, and their students and what their students and families need. And navigating that kind of risk, I think, is really hard for teachers to do. I think we need to rely on some of these networks that have been mentioned already for teachers to share kind of what are their dilemmas, how are they thinking about those kinds of decisions, and think about the ways in which other community members who are not teachers, because often the risk comes from or is perceived to come from parents. And so, how do we think about the ways in which parents and families can be brought into these kinds of conversations in ways that could support educators rather than educators feel like they might face a backlash from parents for some of what they are doing? So, I do think these like communities of practice where educators can share dilemmas, leaders, school leaders also forming similar kinds of groups to think about how do they, in their positions of power, how do they protect their educators in meeting the needs of their students, and also working with families to think about the ways in which families can support the work rather than undermine the work.
I'll just jump in and add that I think that your member network and immigrant community groups more generally have to take school board elections more seriously as well. There's a lot of I feel like I've been part of a number of conversations over the past year where you talk to school superintendents and they have to be increasingly careful because of how politicized a lot of issues have become, and immigration is not the top one in a lot of places. And immigrant communities themselves, I think, have been um, kind of manipulated around some cultural issues as well. And I think it's just really important for folks to take seriously the impact that that's happening in terms of teachers who are socially progressive and trying to, work through an inclusive mindset and really loving and caring for the trajectories of every child. And that, yeah, it's really a dangerous place for them to be. And one of the best ways to help is to have these things be litigated during school board elections. And yeah, and that takes real work in the local community.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think in education and community work, we hear a lot, it takes a village to raise a child, and it truly does. And what you've shared with us today really exemplifies that, from the educator that's in the classroom to the administrators to the parents to the social service organizations that are out in the community. It really takes all of us to build community around children, to build community among each other. And I think in every aspect, not just education, it's trying to look out for our collective well-being. So I want to thank you both for being here with us. We're deeply grateful for your work, for sharing your knowledge and your experience. We invite you to follow the work of Refugee Reach and the Migration Policy Institute and Alianza Americas on social media and our websites. And please stay tuned for future events. Thank you for being part of this conversation. See you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dulce.